What's up, guys, gals, non-binary pals, and none of the above? This is DL bringing you chess content for the first time on this channel, despite me having a chess icon for basically the entirety of my channel has existed. This is going to be me analyzing a game played between Paul Morphy and John Owen in 1858. This is a really interesting game because Paul Morphy was easily the best player of the 19th century in chess, and John Owen was a player I wish I knew more games of. This is a really interesting game from him. The Owen's defense, which is the opening that's going to be played in this, the Owen defense, as you see here, it's actually named after him. And yeah, this is a really interesting matchup. It's a really fun game. I've been learning and analyzing a lot of chess openings over the past month or so, but I want to start looking at some popular games that I can try to learn from players I like, and openings and positions that I like, so I can learn some of the ideas. So I'm definitely going to be looking at some players like Vasily Ivanchuk, that's one of my favorites, Simon Williams, Tigran Petrosian. I think all those players will have some really cool games. Magnus Carlsen's, of course, a great one because he really knows how to squeeze the small advantages. Anyways, okay, yeah, so this is still playing Deshawn's stuff. So, as always, thank you, Deshawn, for the music. So yeah, I don't claim to be a fantastic chess player. I'm not. I'm not going to. I don't have the knowledge to tell you what the lines and variations could have happened. I haven't looked at this game in depth. So this is mostly going to be for my own improvement purposes. This video right here. It's going to be to help me learn and understand what's going on. Alright, so Paul Morphy has the white pieces, and then John Owen is going to have the black pieces here. I know there's some evaluation stuff down there, but it's somewhat cut off, so that should be fine. And I think that it is helpful to have the evaluation on because I always enjoy. It's always odd when you see like two people going for two different ideas in a game, but you're not sure where one side went wrong. I think that's useful to have. So anyways, the first move is king's pawn opening, pawn to e4, as most games were played until the 20th century. And then Owen's going to respond with the unorthodox hypermodern opening of b6, the Owen defense. Morphy plays d4, which is pretty standard, establishing the strong central pawn duo, controls all these juicy squares. Owen, of course, now continues with this plan of fianchettoing his bishop, striking at the center, striking at the e4 pawn. Yeah, Paul Morphy plays bishop to d3, which is the most popular move. This is a game database explorer here. So this makes a lot of sense because it develops this bishop on a fairly active diagonal, potentially pointing towards black's king if he castles kingside, while defending this pawn. And if white wants the option to play knight to e2 at some point rather than knight to f3, which might be the case considering this bishop is striking along this diagonal, then this move allows the bishop to develop before being blocked in by the knight. And so here Owen's going to play e6, which is a pretty flexible move. Opens up this diagonal for this bishop, prepares to strike at the center with potential moves like d5 and f5. Potentially creating another home for the knight on the e7 square as well. So that's just a pretty solid, flexible move that you see played a lot in like the English defense, which also involves this queenside fianchetto, like the Nimzo Indian or Queen's Indian. And this game is it's the Owens defense, but it's kind of a neat little pocket opening. I think it's cool how you're going to see a lot of ideas that you see in more popular openings, like the the Queen's Indian, the Nimzo Indian, the Dutch defense even, and you're able to sort of combine all those ideas, and so it really helps to be a knowledgeable chess player. And now Morphy is going to play. Yeah, knight to h3 is the next move. Hasn't been played very often, it would appear. Not a very popular move in this position. Knight to f3 is more popular, which makes a lot of sense to control, not the square, all these center squares. Maybe Morphy wants to retain the option of playing his pawn to f4, which makes some sense, but I think in that case, then knight to e2 would be a better move. That is the third most popular option. Queen e2 is another popular one that seems like a pretty flexible one. c4 would create a very strong pawn center. But Morphy goes knight to h3. And at this point, I'm going to turn this off because not really many games from here. Right, and so now Owen plays c5, pawn to c5. So this makes a lot of sense. With e6 being played, it is supported by the bishop. The bishop can, in the case of pawn captures, the bishop can recapture and then do a lot of damage along this diagonal. It strikes at white's center directly. And I've noticed with some of these openings that I've been looking at with these fianchetto bishops on the queen side, you see these flank pawns working really well to help coordinate an attack. Like if you saw pawn to f5 here, it'd be coordinating, putting pressure on the e4 square. If only I knew how to get rid of these arrows. Alright, yeah, okay, I can just do the next move. So pawn to c3 is played, which, yeah, obviously it's just developing, it's not developing. It's supporting the center pawn, it's defending the d pawn, it's pretty clear. Also potentially opens up the way for the queen to get active, though with b6 played, it's probably not going to be the way it happens. But the queen could potentially come to c2, maybe the pawn pushes, we form a pretty powerful battery along this diagonal. So c3 seems like a pretty solid move. I'd imagine the next plan for white, and probably a justification for this knight to h3 move, is the idea of playing the bishop to g5, so the knight on h3 supports, which would strike at the queen and either force black to go into a pin, or maybe trade off the dark square bishop, which would be advantageous for white because the dark square bishop is white's bad bishop, whereas this should be a very strong bishop for black, because black's pawns here are on light squares. Though both of black's bishops will be good, since the light square bishop has had the investment of being fianchettoed. So here, Owen releases the tension with c takes d4, and c takes d4. And this might seem a little strange, but I think it makes sense in conjunction with the next move to release the tension, which is knight to c6. Maybe Owen was concerned about what pawn to d5 would be like. And this seems like it's a developing move, strikes at the center again. And so this is nice because it's going to force white's hand to protect this pawn. Pretty common to the French defense, where this bishop plays to d3. It's actually interfering with the queen's defense of the d pawn, and so in a lot of those positions you are chopping with your c pawn on the d pawn to help build up piece tension on this, which becomes a pretty soft spot because of how this bishop has been developed. Why is there no music? Strange. So yeah, I'm expecting bishop to e3. It's a pretty standard way to defend that. You see that in the French and the Alekhine as well. And in the case of d5, which is always a concern in like the Dutch defense when you play knight to c6, is you're worried about the move pawn to d5. But since this d pawn is still here, pawn takes here is not devastating because you can recapture with the d pawn. So you're not too concerned about d5 with tempo. And additionally, in this case, this would give black the opportunity to play his knight to the e5 square, which strikes at this light square bishop. So I believe that's the reason why pawn to d5 is not played. Also, this would result in an isolated queen's pawn, which could be a pretty strong weakness, especially since you know, the pressure that would be applied to it via this bishop, which is fianchettoed. Yeah. So probably didn't want to have a big weakness on the isolated queen's pawn here as well. So bishop to e3 just makes sense. It's a very flexible move. Develops, defends the center. And this is a idea that you see in some lines of the Alekhine defense as well. I believe in the exchange variation, this knight to b4 move. And this makes a lot of sense. While this knight was applying some pressure to here to the d pawn, was also blocking black's bishop, and so black was a bit cramped. So exchanging pieces is a good idea. And then especially the way that this knight is going here, going to c6 to force a tempo meant to defend this pawn. It has bought black the time to play knight to b4, which should capture the light square bishop, which should be very advantageous for black, as it will secure the bishop pair. It will make this monstrous bishop unopposed, and yeah, this bishop is a lot stronger than this knight was. It'll allow this bishop to continue to reign on this diagonal. And white does not have the option, because the knight is still on this square, rather than having played to c3, there's no option of like bishop to b1 here. Also in that case it would kind of block your rook, but you could, you know, crawl out of that with pawn to a3 and then putting your bishop back. And bishop to e2 just drops this pawn, so that's not playable. So here Morphy allows knight captures bishop, and so he just develops reinforcing this. Just obviously this is the strongest square for the knight. You see knight captures bishop, queen captures on d3, and now bishop to b4. This makes a lot of sense in some regards, but it's definitely a trade-off, because pinning this knight, it prepares to exchange the dark square bishop for the white knight, and that would concede the bishop here that Owen has just secured. But on the other hand, it would also strengthen his grip over the light squares, as getting rid of this knight removes a crucial defender of the e4 pawn, and also strengthens black's control over the d5 pawn. And if you see as like a move like knight to f6 coming, or maybe pawn to f5, you can see a lot of assault going to the center, in particular these two light square central squares. Sweat castles, which breaks the pin. But this knight doesn't have a really great way to abuse the fact that this bishop has come out this way. Since the queen has played to d3, there's not like a great queen to b3 move here either to force black's hand. So that's definitely another reason why bishop to b4 was a strong move. But we're actually going to see Owen opt to capture immediately now that this pin is broken, which makes sense because white would have been able to opt out of the pin and maintain his knight, and Owen doesn't want that. A downside of this, though, is that this has strengthened white's center, because white is captured towards the center, and now this d4 pawn is defended by the c pawn. On the other hand, black has achieved a semi-open c file, which the rook is ready to slide onto and apply pressure on this pawn that's a bit backwards at the moment. It'd be very difficult to defend this with the pawn. You have to play up 2 squares to c5, and that's being controlled pretty well. So now we see knight to f6, standard developing move, attacks the e4 pawn. And now white is going to play pawn to e5, which makes a lot of sense. There wasn't really a great way to defend this pawn. Like pawn to f3 is not really a move you want to play. I mean, pawn to f3 is probably okay. Yeah, it's a pretty fine move, but it seems like Morphy. This kind of gets rid of some of Morphy's flexibility in the position, though, because Morphy probably wants to play his pawn to f4 to start striking at the king side, which is where Morphy's pieces are located, and sort of where his pawn chain is pointed towards. And doing this would make it very difficult for him to play f4 in the future, as well as wasting a tempo. So playing moving the game e5 makes sense. So this will give white basically a French defense style center with these fixed pawns on the dark squares, but this also has a downside of opening the vision of this bishop straight into the heart of white's king. So I wouldn't have played the way Morphy's played this far anyways, but this is a move I would definitely hesitate to play, sort of committing this way. So black is going to hop with the knight into d5, this new square, applying pressure on this weak c-pawn, as well as having the option to remove white's bishop as desired. But this knight is also begging to be kicked. c4 is going to come with tempo, and that is indeed what Morphy plays, though this does seem to be a mistake according to the engine. And I believe it's going to do with no, the engine doesn't like the response here. I'm going to turn on the best move arrow here. Okay, so the engine wants, in this position, for Owen to capture the bishop. That'll be an interesting line. And after something like queen captures, to play to castle, and basically just play the bishop for knight here, which I'd definitely agree that the bishop is stronger than the knight in this position. But this is a bit awkward, I'd say, for black. I guess he's probably, he must be playing for the d5 break in this position. Because, so black's going to have the pressure along the c file, the stronger minor piece, and be playing for this d5 break and trying to strike at these pawns. So I agree, this would be a pretty strong continuation for black. Definitely something I would consider playing, though I think I would be somewhat fearful of pawn captures in this position because it would reinforce this d-pawn and open up a file for the rook. Especially if you see maybe the queen hopping into the position, knight coming out to g5. This could be pretty scary. I'm guessing this is why Owen didn't go for this. Also, in this position, the bishop doesn't really stick out as a particularly strong piece. It's pretty passive at the moment. And the pin that Owen opts for looks pretty good at first glance, though the engine says it's +1 for white after this being about this position, or before this, it says it's about equal. So we're going to see bishop to a6. So this is very similar to the Queen's Indian with this fianchetto, where you play b6, but then sometimes you play bishop to a6 to put pressure on the c-pawn. Especially with this file being half open now, seems like a very strong idea. And this also prevents pawn takes because the pawn is now pinned to the queen. So we're going to see the bishop drop back to d2. And this, I believe, is designed to prevent the knight from coming to b4. in this position, the bishop dominates the knight, controlling all of his forward squares. So this seems like a strong relocation of the bishop, if a bit passive, because you're seeing I think the bishop would definitely prefer to come to the g5 square, but knight to b4 looks to be a bit of a nuisance for Team White in this position. Something they are looking to avoid. Alright, and in this position, Black played another move that seems very sensible, but that the engine really doesn't like, which is rook to c8. This piles up on the pinned pawn. Ah, okay, now this makes sense. This is a mistake because of the option to play queen to g3, which breaks the pin on the pawn, renewing the threat of pawn takes knight, while also striking at the g-pawn. So in this position, instead of rook to c8, Black probably should have castled. And it still likes this for White. This knight does seem pretty short on squares in this position. He's probably going to have to retreat to this square. Or no, he won't come there. He would come here. But then you get to f5, and that could be pretty good. Although, if White's going for a kingside attack, then pawn to g4 with tempo could be pretty nasty. But yeah, this would have been a better continuation than rook to c8 because of this tactic. I'm kind of surprised Morphy didn't see that. Like, really surprised. He was such a great tactician. As rook to c8 was played, attacking the c-pawn, and Morphy defended. So missing the queen to g3 tactic. But it still says the position's +1 for White. In this position, Black castled, protecting the g-pawn. And then it says here White plays an inaccuracy, which gives away all of his advantage. He plays queen to b3, which breaks the pin, which is, sensible. But oh, yeah, that looks pretty dirty. Knight to g5, coordinating with the queen on the h7 square, which would is g6 not a good response? No, g6 is a very bad response, they say. So the queen here, and say the knight retreats. Yeah, the knight is coming into the f6 square. Yeah, that is g6 is not a move you want to play. So you have to play f5 in this position, and that weakens a lot of squares. Basically cancels out the possibility of the d5 pawn break. And this Black's dark squares look very weak in this position. Just with the queen coming back. Then this also takes away the f5 square from the knight. So this is not the way Black wants the game to go. White plays queen to b3. So missing this knight to g5 opportunity. And Black retreats the knight now that it is actually attacked by the c-pawn. And looks to reposition to the f5 square, which would be very strong. From the f5 square, striking at this central pawn, especially since you saw earlier that Black removed White's light square bishop. In the French defense, often you want to, which has this similar pawn chain here, and the pawn on e6. You often want to put your knight on f5, but it's often not a good idea if White can have his bishop on d3 and exchange the bishop for the knight, weakening your pawn center, your pawn chain. But since Black has removed the light square bishop, the f5 square should be a very cozy home for the knight. And now in this position, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, putting the bishop on a very active diagonal now, pinning the knight to the rook. Black plays rook here. And yeah, I agree with the engine here. This knight is going to be a lot stronger than this bishop will, in my opinion. And this bishop is currently not doing a ton on this diagonal. The c-pawn is pretty well protected. and the knight's no longer in a position to apply pressure to it. So I think exchanging the bishop for the knight would make a lot of sense. I'm going to turn off the arrow now. But instead, white plays rook from f to d1, which centralizes the rook, prepares the d5 pawn break as well, which would try to crush black and take advantage of white's space advantage. So we have the knight to f5 idea, which makes a lot of sense. And then a pretty committal move from white, just pawn to g4, which obviously evicts the knight from the f5 square, but does create big weaknesses in white's king side. Notably, all these squares I just circled are all now holes in the position, meaning that pawns can no longer control them. And additionally, I feel like this move ignores the fact that this bishop can easily come back to the b7 square. And from this, with the g pawn gone, that just allows it to stare at all these crucial squares near the white king's home. So I think this is definitely a mistake, just as the engine does. g4, that's a move you have to, really think about before playing because it's so committal. So we have the knight coming to h4. Looking to stay around, maybe reposition to g6 if needed, or it can even come into f4 in some positions, I'd imagine. But this just sticks around on the king side. If the queen comes here, oh yeah, and the queen is still defending the knight, so that's a nice perk as well. So the knight's not even loose in this position. So here Morphy plays pawn to f4, which makes a lot of sense, preparing the f5 break. This is a really key break for white against the French defense, which is the sort of pawn structure we're operating in at the moment. But black plays pawn to f6, which is again an idea from the French defense to strike at the base of the pawn chain. You often see like these pawns here in the Steinitz variation of the French, although f6 advance, the f6 pawn break I think is more popular in the advanced French. And so yeah, this is looking to strike at the pawn center, and in the case that Morphy recaptures the f pawn, creating a half open file for the rook. Although the bishop is doing a good job of preventing the rook from coming to f8 or even e7 to try to take control of the f file. The engine says this is the best move, but this is kind of strange because I was just talking about how strong the bishop is at controlling the f file essentially from this diagonal. But Morphy plays pawn back to contest the knight. Now that the move pawn to f6 has been played, it's cut off the communication between the queen and knight, so the knight is hanging in this position. And the engine seems to like pawn to f5, but this seems a little strange because, yeah, it gives white the g5 square and also closes down the position. There aren't really any good pawn breaks left for black. So I don't know how black would push for a win there. So Owen plays f takes e4, which seems more sensible. Renewing the queen's protection of the knight and relieving some of the tension. The engine does prefer what Morphy plays here, which is a d takes. I would personally... Okay, there's a tactic here. So f takes, and there's rook here. What's the issue going on? Oh, the coordination on the f square? So white can't allow this coordination to happen between the knight, the bishop, and the rook along here. So he can't allow this file to be truly open because instead of the rook attacking a pawn here, the rook is now actually coordinating on the f3 square with the knight. So that's why d takes is preferred. Some of these older games are interesting, look, because people made more mistakes in them. But you're really seeing, you know, some of the godfathers of chess, essentially. You know, obviously chess has been around a lot longer than 1858, but this is really when the game was really being developed. Though, like, I think Nimzovich is definitely somebody you want to look into if you want to know, like, real development of chess. Like, I think Nimzovich developed the game more than anybody else did in terms of, you know, basic strategies and ideas. There's so many openings named after him too. So we see queen to e7, which is listed as a mistake. Giving away, yeah, all of black's slight edge and giving white the advantage again. Bishop to b7 does seem to make a lot of sense. Just knifing into the position. The bishop's not really doing anything here. So I think this is a pretty smart, sensible move that I would definitely play over the board. Just improving the position of my piece because the bishop's pretty inactive here. I'm also kind of worried about queen here. So after queen e7, it says knight g5 is a good move, but I'd be concerned about a move like this. White needs to continue to control the f3 square. So that's why a queen here. Because imagine black didn't have this and black like retreated here. Well, one, there's coordination on the d pawn. But also, yeah, I was gonna say, like, even if the queen was still here, let's say instead of queen d7 you played some silly move like this. So yes, the queen's defending this, but you don't trap the queen because the bishop's hanging. So that was something I was looking at when I was initially going over the game. Is the potential to skewer the bishop and pawn here, maybe get at the queenside structure. But this knight is actually really strong because of this g-pawn. You're seeing how it's weakening the squares in white's camp and really forcing Morphy to play moves you really wouldn't prefer because you don't want to give them this f-file. Though the d-file is pretty nice for Morphy as well. This backwards pawn fixed by this pawn. So I guess d takes does make a lot of sense. But I don't like giving my opponent's counterplay. Who does? So queen d7 is listed as a mistake because of knight to g5, which is what Morphy plays. The knight is evicted with h6, and then the knight pivots here where it's going to plant itself on the d6 square, which is a hole in black's position, supported by this strong central pawn on e5. And if black does nothing, then also forking the two rooks. So instead of queen here, so bishop here, and does that prevent this? So in this position, it says black is better because of this. And because the bishop has repositioned along this diagonal, the knight no longer has the e4 square to work with. And the knight is able to reroute to the g6 square, and black's going to be able to coordinate an attack on the f pawn from this position. So that's another perk of the bishop coming, is to control this e4 square and prevent the knight from pivoting along it and getting into this really sensitive hole on d6. So queen d7, knight to g5, h6. I mean, the knight wants to come here anyways. It's not really threatening anything. I mean, I guess he's worried about like the queen coming to d3 and then coordinating on h7. But knight to g6 makes a lot of sense to just reposition the knight and pressure here. And it does also blunt this diagonal so that white would no longer be threatening checkmate or anything like that. I mean, the king has this square now. But yeah. So h6, and then the knight hops into the square. Now the bishop comes here, and white plays queen to d3, which defends the knight and also doubles along the d file. just generally improves the position of the queen. She's not really doing much here, staring at her own pawn and biting on a rock on b6. So now we have rook over to attack the f pawn. Bishop captures. Yeah, the bishop's a pretty passive piece in this position. And Morphy goes for the strongest move, knight to f6 check, and it cannot be captured with a pawn because of queen to g6 check. And after king here, there's rook to d7, which is coordinating along the 7th rank. And the best move in this position is to give up the queen to prevent checkmate. Oh, actually, well, this does pin the queen back, but you're giving up a rook. It's still terrible. Says you'll be down the exchange. Your pawn's will be really weak. Its position's +6 for white. But Owen plays a much stronger move than pawn takes. It's the engine suggestion, the exchange sacrifice. So you obviously no longer have queen to g6 check. And after pawn takes knight, we have queen taking the g pawn with check. I did question this move myself as well because I think the queen exchange favors white in this position. Now that white is up in exchange. See there, and then we got queen to g3, which basically forces the exchange of queens. There's not really a good retreat here. Another key point of this exchange sacrifice is that you see in this position, all of white's pawns are isolated. And then the piece that black has in exchange for rook, it's this bishop, which is very strong. It's going to be able to glue the position together very well. Able to pressure a lot of pawns. And all of these pawns are going to be excellent targets for the black pieces, especially if black can successfully fix them on light squares where they are targets for the bishop. So that is another perk of this exchange sacrifice, is ruining white's pawn structure, which is going to be very important as we approach an endgame. So queen takes, this does prepare the structure a bit, and this will be able to be liquidated. So this makes, you need to defend your pawn chain here. So white liquidates this weakness, plays his king up. Black is getting his king into the position. Yeah, this does seem strange. By moving the king here, white is allowing the king to make use of the black king to make use of this square potentially, and the white king is also not around to stop the h pawn. I think, and this would have been a stronger move. I'm not sure what white's problems are in this position. Yeah, this seems like a very comfortable position for white because you're going to be able to slide this rook over, and potentially even pick up this h pawn. So king here, king e3 is definitely a mistake, as it allows pawn to h4, and this position's going from about plus 0.7 for white to about half pawn advantage for black. So now we see rook to d2. This bishop's doing a very good job of disrupting the rook's abilities to contest this h-file. Past pawns must be pushed. So now the rook finally blockades, but because this pawn has been allowed to advance so far, it's now on a square where it can coordinate with the bishop and glue together this knight and this knight. This rook is now completely zoned out of the game. Yeah, Morphy should not have allowed this coordination, because who cares that you have this rook for this bishop? This rook is literally stuck. Anywhere it goes, it will be captured by the bishop. And at this point, Morphy is going to be forced to go for to sack the exchange himself in exchange for this h-pawn, because this rook is completely dead. So it looks like he prepares to take twice on the g2 square. Said rook to h2 is a mistake. What does the engine prefer instead? So it says rook here, which would prevent the bishop from coming here because of rook takes here. And if the pawn is pushed, we have a check. And in this case, you're again going to lose the exchange, but in this line, you are instead you will have removed black's d-pawn, which moves it from being favorable for black to being favorable for white. So this is a much stronger variation for white. Because now black is able to keep his d-pawn after the move pawn to d5. So g6 is considered a mistake. Trying to get the king to bolt, I presume, but this just loses the d-pawn after not the d-pawn, the c-pawn. So he's trying to force the rook over there, but I don't see why this move would be played unless you're trying to capture here. But obviously you need to snap off this first. So now the exchange sacrifice comes through, but in this position, black now has 4 pawns to white's 3, and this pawn, which could have been safe on g5, is now overextended on g7. So those pawns are exchanged, and black's rook is getting active, very easily pressuring here. And after the rook comes to passively defend, now this rook is applying pressure to both of white's pawns from the same square, while also defending the weak point in black's position. So this rook is fantastically placed. And Morphy resigns in this position because after king here and king here, this pawn will drop and black will be up 2 pawns. And even though it's a rook endgame, even if you do that, like this is coming, now the a pawn's dropping, now black has connected past pawns. This is a completely winning endgame for Owen. Right, so that was a really interesting game. Mistakes on both sides. The missed opportunities were interesting. I really enjoyed a lot of the thematic pawn breaks in the position and the way that pieces could reposition in the more closed positions. I liked seeing how each player valued different pieces at different points in time. Some of the key ideas, I think, from this knight to h3 is kind of a strange move. The c5 attack, knight to c6 into b4 to get rid of the light square bishop. I think that was a really instructive idea. I've definitely seen this in some lines of the Alekhine defense. This was a bit questionable, but I think it makes sense. If A then B. Yeah, and I definitely feel like Owen did miss out on an opportunity because this knight had the potential to become a very awkward piece if white played this a little differently. And this is missing this tactic. This is why you castle, folks. You don't want to lose your g-pawn. That's the heart of your king structure. And Morphy just missing out on opportunities to attack the king side seems very uncharacteristic of him, given what he's known for as being, playing these brilliant tactics and being like a strong attacking player. It seems very odd of him to miss this. This bishop to a6 maneuver onto the c4 square looked strong, but you need to, instead of the bishop here, the game preferred exchanging the knight for bishop. Another perk of the bishop dropping back here that I didn't think about before was opening up the queen to reposition to the g3 square. But if Morphy thought of that, then I feel like Morphy would have played queen to g3 in this position. This knight repositioning to f5 is definitely an idea I was familiar with. g4 is kind of a questionable move. The f6 break was very thematic, and I think this is definitely a mistake. Why are you not putting your bishop on this diagonal when it's not doing anything on a6 anymore? And then I would not have played h6. I mean, the engine says it's fine, but I feel like white's going to play knight to e4 anyways. And then if I want to reposition my knight, I might as well do it now. Like it seems like a tempo loser. So the exchange sacrifice does white have another option here? No, because if he plays king, there's checkmate, and then this is mate in 4. So there's no other option for black. So very resourceful exchange sacrifice. Still sets white's better here, and this is just a massive endgame blunder. It says it's only really losing from this is where it goes really downhill. This coordination between the bishop and pawn was very strong. This rook completely isolated. So this is a really cool game. Thank you all for watching. I know this is more for my benefit than that of the spectators, but hopefully you thought this was a cool game as well. It's all the way from 1858, and you should check out some more Paul Morphy games. They're pretty cool. Thanks all for watching.